the session with Zach Gomo on Crusades. My name is Alex Katz. I'm the chair of the Council of Christians and Jews, and it gives me great pleasure to have Zach speak to us this afternoon. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we sit. I'm on the Kulin, on the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I'm sure wherever we all are, we pay our respects to those that have come before us. And I think in this case, it's particularly interesting and particularly appropriate to talk about those that have come before us, because a lot of what we have today is because of history, which is exactly what our topic is today. So thank you for joining us. Thank you especially the Jews amongst us for joining us in between two of the most holy days of the year. So I think that's important to acknowledge. And I think on that note, let me take this opportunity to introduce Zach. Rabbi Zachary Gomo is the director of Jewish life at Bialik College. Before starting his career in education, he studied at a Jewish seminary in Israel and served in the combat unit of the Israeli Air Force. He has since completed 3 university degrees and is a recipient of the Australian National Excellence in Teaching Award and was Secondary School Teacher of the Year. He is also a member of the Australian College of Educators and has a particular interest in history and how his history affects our world, as I said. He's also, as his title suggests, recently received rabbinic ordination, and he's also one of the most beloved teachers in his school, amongst many other accolades. So, and I'm sure we'll all find that how wonderful of a teacher he is. I've known him for a while, and I also heard him present this probably quite similar, maybe a little different presentation some weeks ago. And I thought it was absolutely right up our alley for the Council of Christians and Jews. So on that note, Zach, if you unmute, I'll hand it over to you. And it's...
Thank you so much, Alex. And when Alex did invite me to speak here today, I was extremely honored. And as I mentioned earlier before we started, this is actually my first opportunity ever to speak to at least a partially dedicated Christian audience. So it's a big milestone for me and something quite exciting for me that I haven't experienced until now. And whilst anybody who's familiar with the internal machinations of the Jewish community probably knows that it could be a minefield in and of itself that one learns to navigate throughout their life. And certainly this is a new space for me. And I am speaking from, my knowledge base and my understanding, which is very much colored by my background as a Jewish person. And the absolute last thing that I'd like to do throughout this experience is anything that would offend or upset. That's the exact opposite reason why I'm here. I think that the stated goals of this group is absolutely outstanding and pivotal. And I would hate to do anything that would kind of contradict that. So please, if I do say anything that somebody views differently or otherwise, it is not by any means an attempt to offend or otherwise. So I just want to give that proviso. So I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint now, which is a technique that I like to use. I find it a helpful medium to kind of share with people. Is everybody able to see my PowerPoint there? If someone gives me a nod, take that away. Fantastic. I'm just trying to maximize this. Okay. So I am going to speak today about the Crusades, but not in the abstract. I want to kind of speak about the Crusades in terms of how they came to be, but perhaps even more significantly, what their impact on Jewish and Christian and global history was as well, because I think that they do represent a very, very significant epoch and a significant turning point in many, many ways that are important to understand the modern world as it exists. And to start off with, I want to bring up this map, which kind of shows the Mediterranean world in the early Middle Ages. And what I think is immediately striking to the modern eye is if we look at Christian Europe, which is essentially the area in purple, we see that this is not a significant part of the world on a global scale. This isn't by any means the entire Mediterranean world. It's not even by any means all of Europe. And in some ways, this is a empire, well, it's not an empire, a civilization, a culture in retreat. In particular, in the face of the expanding Islamic world at the time. And I think that whenever we look at history, there is a tendency, which is very natural, to perceive the past through the lens of the outcome that now exists. Now, we all know that in the centuries to follow, the Christian world, the Western world, however we want to define it, was going to become significantly powerful on a global scale, was going to dominate much of the world outside of Christian Europe. But nobody knew that then. Nobody knew that then. This was not a fait accompli. This was not on the cards. Just like we cannot, with any sense, I think, of reasonableness, predict what the world is going to look like half a millennia from today, neither could people in the past. And I want to give just one example to illustrate this point. I think we often underestimate what the significance of the Columbian Exchange was. And what I mean by the Columbian Exchange was when Europeans started to conquer and colonize the Americas, there was an exchange of produce. And some of that produce came from Europe to the Americas. Some of that exchange, most of it was pretty negative, smallpox and other things. But an enormous amount went the other way. And I'm talking about things like corn, the majority of beans that we have today, potatoes, chili, cocoa, tomatoes. If we think about what our civilization is built on from a caloric perspective, right? The fuel that literally lets us go. There was not access to this in pre-Columbian Europe. It just didn't exist. Nobody in Italy had a pizza. Nobody in Switzerland had chocolates. Indeed, nobody in Thailand had a chili. None of this existed. And this is, as a result, a poorer world in many ways, a less secure world in terms of the ability to literally not starve. This is a different world. It's a smaller world, and it's a world in retreat. I want to go back just briefly to 380. As Jews, we would normally refer this to CE. I know in the Christian context, AD, when the Roman Empire adopts Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire to the exclusion of all others. And again, I think that we often forget today that the overwhelming majority of the Mediterranean world, including the Middle East, was Christian at this time, at least on the political level, and increasingly so on a cultural and population level. This is a Christian world. And shortly after 380 AD, very shortly after, in 395, the Roman Empire splits. It splits into the Western Roman Empire with its capital in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire with its capital in Byzantium, then Constantinople, today Istanbul. Again, another kind of introductory point that I want to make, I have a very personal issue. I'm probably one of the only people in the world that gives it as much thought as I do, by the labeling of the Eastern Roman Empire as the Byzantine Empire. That's often the term that's given. And I have an issue with that for a number of reasons. One is nobody who ever lived in that empire, as long as it existed, until 1453, when Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Turks, would have had any idea what you meant by Byzantine. They would not have known what you were talking about. They referred to themselves, understood themselves, saw themselves, and was seen by everybody as Romans. Indeed, it's very much a Western European kind of imposition to say that the West was the real Roman Empire and the East was something else called Byzantium. I think that's historically inaccurate. I think the East Roman Empire was the Roman Empire. It was the longest lasting iteration of the Roman Empire. It lasted for a millennia, far longer than the empire in the West did. It was the also wealthier and in many ways more significant, geographically significant part of the empire. And indeed, it is not long, it is basically a century after the partition, without the connection to the East and the wealth and everything that represented, that the Western Roman Empire falls. You often hear about people speak about history as being this kind of continuous upward trend, that living standards always increase, wealth increases, opportunities, knowledge increases. And that really, I think, when one studies history, you see it could not be further from the truth. And just ask anybody that lived for probably 1.5 millennia after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and they would tell you things were better before. And they often knew things were better before because they saw the ruins of the West, and the ruins of the Western Roman Empire were inconceivable to them. It was inconceivable that people could live in cities of this size, that you would have a sewerage network that would enable people to live in communities this large, that you would have buildings of this scale and sophistication, that you would have trade that was this global, that you would have heating underfloor in people's homes and public baths, things that in Europe simply weren't the case until the Renaissance. And there were limited institutions that survived the fall of the Roman Empire. And I think it was the limited institutions that really defined what made this world so precarious, so dangerous, and so chaotic in some ways. Of course, one of the few institutions to survive, perhaps the dominant institution to survive, is the Catholic Church. And again, I'm sure there are people here who are far more expert on this than myself, but it is a Catholic Church in Western Europe that preserves significantly literacy. It is extremely limited outside of the Catholic Church. And again, many of the sense of what was lost when the Roman Empire fell, of having any kind of institutional structures that span beyond the most local that possibly exist. And also, I think it's important to remember, 1066, the Battle of Hastings, we still have Viking raids in Northern Europe. This is a precarious, dangerous time and place to live. I'm sure many of you are aware of the feudal system that was significant in Western European medieval life. Structures that were based on relationships, but significantly on relationships to violence. The knighthood, the aristocracy, and indeed the nobility have their position in Western European society significantly, perhaps predominantly in many ways, because of the structure that enables them to carry out violence for those that they serve, for the nobility and the aristocracy that they serve. And so violence is not peripheral to medieval Christian European life, but is really actually quite central and important. And again, part of this is about controlling land, but even more significantly about controlling people, because population does decline significantly when you can't sustain cities with large populations, when you can't sustain large-scale agriculture, when you don't have trade with more temperate parts of the world that enable a large amount of caloric food security. Controlling the small population that remains, tying them to the land in what eventually becomes known as serfdom, is extremely, extremely important. And indeed, if we look at this image here, we see something quite telling. And of course, this was not a view of the world shared by all Europeans. In particular, the Catholic Church often took issue with this kind of culture that was developing. We see two knights in combat, one splitting open the head of the other, and the fair maidens above are not recoiling in disgust or horror, but are swooning over these figures, because indeed it is the ability to undertake violence that is respected in a society in which violence rules. So let's look back at this initial map that I showed you. And we see this small peripheral, remember, without the Americas, this is the periphery, this is the end of the earth, European Christian civilization that is attacked on all sides. In the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, fights off an Arab Muslim invasion from Spain at the gates of Paris. You know, it was a hairbreadth. Would there ever be a France in the way that we knew that it would develop in the centuries? This was by no means secure, confident, powerful. This was a civilization in retreat, in defense. There were those who had greater success in unifying the Western Christian European world. Charlemagne, Charles de Grosse, as the Germans call him, was of course one of the most significant, and he styled himself Roman Emperor. Again, we look at the 5th century as a time when the Western Roman Empire fell, but there was no man or woman standing there with one of those editors cut a board saying cut, that said the Roman Empire was over. It was not clear when it was over. People didn't know if and when it was over. And for centuries, people didn't believe it was over and hoped that it could indeed be reestablished. And Charlemagne was one of the most successful at doing so and established what he termed the Holy Roman Empire. But as it was famously and often been stated, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was a collection of princely states. But this, you know, there was this attempt to revive. But whilst all of this was happening in the West, again, we just have to recenter and remember that the Roman Empire is still in its height in the East. That in what we call, again, as I said, erroneously Byzantium, they are building incredible structures like the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. And indeed, this is a Roman city, a Roman empire to all effects. This is the ruins in the West that seemed inconceivable are still being built in the East. Still being built in the East. Something that we were speaking about football a little earlier that I found quite interesting. An area that is very difficult, Byzantine studies, as it's called, is actually, you know, I think quite under-researched in general, but in particular, the Jewish history of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, is very scarcely resourced. I have what I've been able to scrounge together a few books, but there aren't that many, even though it is, I think, very, very significant. But a funny little episode is that there was, of course, the chariot arena in Byzantium and Constantinople that was very much a center of cultural and also political life. And there were various teams that people followed with great dedication, so much so that riots over these teams often led to the deposing of emperors and whatnot. And the two most popular teams were the Greens and the Blues. And it's written that the Jews of the Byzantine Empire were generally quite partial for the Blues. And as an Essendon fan, it pains me to think that the connection between Jews and the Blues is something that has gone back millennia, if not further, but so be it. So what's happening in the Islamic world at this time? So Islam enters the stage with a bang, say. In the certainly by the 7th century, the Islamic community, the founding community of Islam in the what is today Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, spreads with incredible speed throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Incredible speed. And there's an infinite number of explanations as to why that occurred and why that was the case. Plague affecting the Byzantine and Persian empires, who were the two major players on the world scene at that time is one explanation given, the infighting between them that weakened them and distracted them. Of course, according to the perspective of many Muslims, this is a divine will that is playing out here. But needless to say, the Islamic world becomes large and significant in a very short period of time. But in an equally short period of time, in many ways, this world fractures. And it fractures into competing caliphates that compete on a number of levels. But one of the most significant levels is the divide that comes to exist between Sunni Muslims, who ultimately end up in the majority, and Shia Muslims, who end up in the minority. And one of the most significant Shia caliphates is the Fatimid Caliphate based in Cairo. And this caliphate kind of becomes dominant in 1000 AD, in the time that we're going to start to look at here. And there are some fascinating nuances in the Islamic world at this time, because we might imagine that the Islamic world was monolithic or had, you know, a concurrence of perspective, and that couldn't be, again, further from the truth. There was, of course, the Shia-Sunni divide, but even further, there were kind of breakaways or even further movements in the Shia world in particular, some of which I think are quite fascinating. And I just want to briefly touch on two. And one of them is the Nizari Ismailis. And the Nizari Ismailis retreat to the mountains around what is today Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel, because they are persecuted by the Sunni majority and even by some Shia. And they have some intricacies, and it's hard to differentiate between what's true and what was kind of stories made up by their enemies. But they would retreat to these mountains, and one of their leaders was known, or a number of their leaders, again, it's not true if it was one person or many, as the Old Man of the Mountain. And he was famously or infamously able to, at the snap of his fingers, command one of his loyal soldiers to jump from these mountain fortresses to their death. And when asked why his followers would do so, the explanation allegedly given is that when people would join this movement, young men would join this group in the first time, their first evening, they would be taken into a beautiful garden, and they would be given copious amounts of narcotics and given all the pleasures of the world. And they would have this kind of pleasure-filled evening, fall into a stupor, wake up with a big headache in the morning, and be told, you just received a glimpse of heaven. If you die for the Ismaili cause, you will have this for all eternity. And the rumor or the accusation going around is that one of these narcotics was, of course, what is known in Arabic as hashish, or marijuana, and which gave them the name or the insult of the Hashishin, which became anglicized as the assassins. Of course, this is one of the groups that was there, which I think is quite interesting. Another one of the groups, the last one that I'd like to discuss, were followers of the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo, known as Al-Hakim. And Al-Hakim was a very polarizing figure in Islamic history. Most Muslims, in particular Sunni Muslims, view him as quite an evil figure, and he is claimed to have introduced some rather bizarre laws, such as making it illegal to be awake during the day and illegal to be asleep at night, and all of these bizarre kind of rules that were instituted, and ultimately he disappeared. And most historians and most Muslims believe that he disappeared because he was murdered by his own sister, who said, this guy's lost his mind, he's got to be the end of us all. She got rid of him in the desert. But a small group believed that he did not actually die, but that he kind of disappeared into the ether to return at some point in future from China to help this group of his followers conquer the world. And this group was also persecuted in Egypt and fled, as the people often did, to the mountains of northern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria today. And that group still exists, and they are known as the Druze. The Druze minority, who are quite prominent in Israel in particular. And so this is a really fascinating time in Islamic history where there's a lot of dynamism, and there is a great plethora of ideas and worldviews and kind of nuances that I think really is very, very fascinating. And many people do identify this as an Islamic golden age. And in many ways, certainly compared to what was happening in Western Europe, this is very much a golden age. The Islamic world, as the entire Eastern Mediterranean world is, including the Eastern Roman Empire, is wealthier, in some ways safer, more cosmopolitan, more sophisticated, has a greater continuing connection with the wisdom and knowledge of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. It has greater access to trade from the East and all of the benefits that provides. But where are the Jews? Haven't really spoken about Jews that much until now. Well, here's another kind of shift, a mental shift that we need to make. I think often people, particularly in the West, when they think of Jews, predominantly think of a specific type of Jew. They probably think of a type of Jew kind of represents me. The Ashkenazi Jew whose recent ancestry, at least, is from Eastern Europe. And there's a logic to that. The majority of Jews in places like Australia and North America, although by no means all, came as waves of migration from Eastern Europe over the last 100, 200 years. But that by no means encompasses all of world Jewry, and encompasses almost no Jews at the time in which we're speaking. There are almost no Jews in Eastern Europe in the Middle Ages. There are a small number of Jews in Western Europe, and I'll speak about them briefly. But the majority of Jews live in the Middle East and North Africa. That is where Judaism begins, that's where Judaism starts, and that's where the majority of Jews at this time are. In fact, when the Abbasid Empire the Abbasid Caliphate was at its height, it's estimated that 90% of all Jews in the world were under their dominion. In North Africa or the Levant, the rest of the Middle East. And they were, yes, subjects of these Islamic caliphates, but at the same time, not. Now, there was a very interesting figure in Jewish history, often forgotten, known as the Exilarch, or in Aramaic, the Resh Galuta. And even many Jews might not be aware of this. They might say it, but even so not kind of absorb it. We have on our Saturday prayers in the Musaf, the second half of the morning prayers, a prayer called Yakum Pokan, which is in Aramaic, and actually prays for the well-being of our ruler, the Resh Galuta, the Exilarch. Now, many of you might be saying to yourselves, who is this Exilarch that he's speaking about that probably most Jews today have not ever even heard of? Well, when the Babylonians conquer Jerusalem and destroy the first temple, they take the royal house, the house of David, into captivity into Babylon. And they kind of keep them for safekeeping in Babylon with the knowledge that these are kind of the legitimate royal family of the Jewish people. And being able to control them is beneficial for anybody who might want to control larger parts of the Middle East. There are a lot of Jews there, the land of Israel in addition. And when the Babylonians themselves are conquered by the Persian Empire with Cyrus the Great, and when the Persians are conquered by the Islamic caliphates, they all maintain this. They all see value in having this at least titular king of the Jews in their pocket, so to speak. And indeed, this Exilarch rules from Babylon with great pomp and circumstance as a state official of the Babylonian state, the Persian Empire, in a number of its iterations, in the Arab caliphates, as well as the formal ruler of the Jews. And as I said, till today in synagogues, Jews every Saturday pray for the well-being of this gentleman. Now, in centuries to follow, it was kind of lost who the exact Exilarch was, but I'd hope that you are pleased, feel safe to know that there is till today an older Iraqi Jewish gentleman who left Baghdad to live in London, who claims to be the Exarch and produces a bi-monthly newsletter called the Exarch Times. So it is still alive as an institution, regardless of how few recognize or even know that it exists. There is also in Babylon, which was a great center of Jewish life, rivaled in many ways by Egypt, but still very, very significant, Pudita and Sura, which were two cities in Babylon where the Babylonian Talmud is written. And it is at this time, in the early Middle Ages and mid-Middle Ages, that the Babylonian Talmud is written, this seminal text in many ways of Jewry. And these academies are run by Gaonim. A Gaon in Hebrew can be loosely translated as a genius or a great mind, would kind of be the sense. And sometimes the Gaon is the Exarch, often they're not. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they compete for leadership and significance. But it's very clear that the center of Jewish life, the kind of weight of Jewish life, is in the East. As that slowly decreases, Egypt becomes significant, and Spain, by the High Middle Ages, extremely well, what we call today Spain, and Portugal then it was Al-Andalus, part of the Islamic world. Now, what's also very significant, I think, to point out, is there is often a myth propagated, even taught in Jewish schools to Jewish students, and many young Jews understand it this way, although it's blatantly false, that in 70 CE, when the Romans crushed the Jewish revolt against Rome and destroyed the Second Temple, that they cut off all the Jews of the land of Israel and put them in exile. And basically you get from 70 CE to 30 seconds later, Fiddler on the Roof, right? It's just not the case, and that's not how it occurs. And we know it's blatantly not how it occurs because there are many, many subsequent Jewish revolts against Rome. Bar Kokhba revolt very famously happens a generation or two later, and indeed in almost every subsequent generation, Jews revolt against what they perceive as the Roman Empire, again, the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, all the way up to 614, when there is a Jewish revolt against Heraclius, the Eastern Roman Emperor, in cahoots with the Persians, which is in the short term actually successful. The Jews actually succeed in gaining control of Jerusalem, attempt to rebuild the temple, but when the Islamic caliphates conquer, this kind of seems to end. It's also important to note that for the most part, and again, there's nuance here, and we're talking about many centuries, many regimes, many geographical areas. Life for Jews under Christian empires, whether that was in the West or in the East, was generally worse than it was under the Islamic caliphates. Again, we're talking about huge expanses of time and place and regime. So, making blanket statements like that is dangerous. But on average, life was significantly freer, safer, and more prosperous for Jews in the Islamic world in the Middle Ages than it was in the Christian world. Of course, there being exceptions in either direction. But let's look now at the Jews in the West, in medieval Catholic Europe. Now, I've got an image here of Jews wearing the infamous Jew hat that Jews were often forced to wear in the Middle Ages in Western Europe, along with distinction badges, often a yellow badge that obviously echoes what's to come later in the Holocaust, this idea of Jews being in cahoots in the devil and condemned to hell. Now, much of this, significantly, and I think this is important to point out, is a post-Crusades phenomenon. Jews are by no means free, equal, entirely safe prior to the Crusades in Western Europe, but they're a lot freer, more equal, and safer than after the Crusades in Western Europe. And I'm going to show you why that is. So I'm not going to go into enormous depth here because obviously, I could be here for hours, but I know that maybe not everybody else would appreciate that. Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade in 1095, and there are numerous accounts as to why he does so. Numerous accounts of his speech when he does so, and numerous kind of speculations and ideas as to why he does so. But suffice to say, there's obviously the desire for conquest. There's a desire, many say, to release the pressure valve on Europe from this violence that was becoming so significant and so difficult to contain. But no one can deny that at least part of the motivation for the Crusades, as it is understood by those hearing it, is the idea of remission of sin, is the idea that if you go to the Holy Land and liberate these sites that are significant from Jesus' life in particular, and you do battle with those who would see otherwise along the way, that this could absolve one of sin. And this cannot be underestimated or undervalued as a motivating factor, at least by many of those who hear this call for the crusade. By all accounts, when this crusade is called, the crowd yells out, Deus vult, God wills it, in Latin as a response. Now, the problem for the Pope in many ways when this crusade is called is that, initially at least, exactly the people that he doesn't want to answer it do. Because remember, in Europe, you have the majority of the population who are living as serfs, who are tied to the land, and their tie to land is seen as necessary for the survival of this society and for the production of food in many, many ways. And I apologize for my children in the background. And in many other ways, there is the aristocracy, the knighthood, who are these professional warriors. And of course, when you want to send people out to war, you want the professionals, not the amateurs. And it's exactly the amateurs whose hope will stay and grow the food. But of course, if you are a medieval peasant living in France, let's say, with rarely the opportunity to leave the environs of your own village, and you have this opportunity to go on this incredible journey that will not only allow you to see so much more of the world than you ever imagined, but will allow you to see the most holy of sights and the remission of sin. You're going to want to go. Like, I get it. There's an appeal there. But a problem happens. Whilst many of the professional crusaders take great pains to prepare themselves for these journeys, to often mortgage their land, to equip themselves in significant number, to organize passage via sea to get to the Holy Land safely, or as safely as they can hope, the peasantry goes by foot. And in many ways, they're often led by this enigmatic figure, Peter the Hermit, who leads this great mass of people by foot across Europe. But the problem that they soon encounter is that France is quite far from Jerusalem, particularly by land. And as they approach, and as you can imagine, every village, every farm, every town they approach is not too pleased to see them, because of course they need to eat, they need to sleep, they need to drink. They become increasingly despondent. And they start to realize that the infidel is not just in distant Jerusalem, but here as well. And they are in various degrees take this call as they've understood it, remission of sin through fighting the infidel, and turn it on the Jews, the small number of Jews, one might add, of Western Europe at this time. Now, the church and much of the aristocracy are actually not in agreement with this. In many cases, they oppose this and actually provide refuge and attempt to intervene. At this stage, in later Crusades, things will change with the Jews, because the Jews, for the authorities at this time, present quite an important, useful role. This is a couple of versions of a piece of art known as Ecclesiastes and Synagoga from medieval Catholic Europe. And in it, you see the church on the left, proud, strong, radiant, upright, looking off into the future. And on the east, you see Synagoga, who is despondent, downtrodden, her staff is broken, she is blind to the truth, and she is very much in the past. And the perspective at this time is, yes, let Jews live among us as a living testament of the error of their ways and of the right of ours. So the Crusaders ultimately arrive in Constantinople for the First Crusade, and they get a bit of a shock. They get a bit of a shock because remember where they've come from and what they now see. And in many ways, and I think maybe I forgot to mention this earlier, part of the call from the Crusades that Alexis, the emperor in the East, asks the Pope for assistance to defend against the Islamic world that is on the doorstep of Constantinople at this time, and who indeed many centuries earlier had conquered Jerusalem from the Eastern Empire. And the Crusaders get to Constantinople, seeing a city beyond anything they could possibly have imagined. And they say to themselves, we're going to help them? Why do they need us? This doesn't make any sense. And the people in Constantinople see the Crusaders and say, they're the ones who are going to help us? Smell them. Now this is quite a shock, and they're not let into the city. They're pushed around and said, go along your way. It's not a particularly amicable connection, but many of the Crusaders do continue on from Byzantium, whereas others do come by sea, eventually entering Jerusalem in 1099. Interesting also to note that in defending Jerusalem and other cities such as Haifa in particular, there are notable cases of Jews fighting with the Muslims against the Crusaders, unsuccessfully, obviously, initially. And we have a number of accounts of what happens in Jerusalem when the Crusaders enter. And I think it's important to note that many of the Crusaders mistake the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, which stand today in Jerusalem, for the Temple of Solomon. So kind of unclear is their understanding of even where they are and what the history is. Quite striking. Those that are aware will know that that Temple of Solomon was destroyed by the Babylonians. A second temple was built and refurbished by Herod, destroyed by the Romans. It's a completely unclear understanding of where they are. But look at these accounts. Our men were killing and slaying even to the Temple of Solomon, where the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. In the temple and porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. In this temple, 10,000 were killed. Indeed, if you had been there, you would have seen our feet colored to our ankles with the blood of the slain. But what more shall relate, none of them were left alive. Neither woman nor children were spared. This is obviously quite a unpleasant experience for those involved. So how did the Crusaders do it? How did they ultimately establish, conquer this part of the world, which again, we said, seems to have been a much more sophisticated, cosmopolitan, wealthier part of the world, and establish these Crusader states, these feudal kingdoms, very much mirrored on the feudal kingdoms in Europe. And again, like everything, there are numerous explanations, but one that I particularly appreciate on a very limited level, there's a podcast called Hardcore History. I don't know if anybody's heard it. He's made by a man named Dan Carlin. He's not a professional historian, and he himself admits that quite openly. But it's very entertaining, and he has an interesting way of looking at things. And he said something that I thought was quite interesting. And he said that the West has always fought like Mike Tyson, whereas the East has always fought like Muhammad Ali. What was Mike Tyson's tactic? He was the strongest guy in the ring. That was his tactic. He hit you harder than anybody else. And in many ways, there's a kind of truth to that, right? The West, how does the West fight? The B-52 bomber, right? It's the biggest bomb. And that in this time, that was the same with the West, that if you look at the medieval knight, it was the largest horse with the heaviest armor and the heaviest lance. It was like a battering ram. Whereas the East was like Muhammad Ali. The idea was not to be the strongest. The idea was to be the smartest. And the idea was to use the enemy's strength against them. And initially, the balance is in the side of the West. The East, this is often cavalry battles, are far more lightly armored. The Arab militaries, far smaller horses, and it's not clear to them how to use the West's military strength against them yet. The West also did what it did in this aristocracy did in Europe. One of the ways that they control populations, again, they control the serfs in Europe in the same way, is through the use of these incredible castles. Now, this is Crac de Chevalier in modern day Syria, still being used today militarily in the Syrian civil war, built in the Crusades. And the idea is this is like an aircraft carrier of the ancient world, that you have an incredibly impenetrable fortress on a mountain top dominating a large area with a relatively small body of professional knights who are cavalry, who can't control a large area simultaneously with their large number, but at any point in time can ride out of the castle where they are completely defended and have pinpoint attacks against various points of need and then retreat. And this burden is often done and often carried by these orders, such as the Templars, whose symbol you can see here, who come to fulfill this role. But as we all know, I assume we can all imagine, the Crusader states do not last forever. And one of the reasons why they don't is because of this gentleman named Saladin. Sorry, excuse me. Now, Saladin is a fascinating figure. He is a Sunni Muslim. He is not an Arab. He is a Kurd from northern Iraq, actually born in Tikrit, which is he wasn't born quite in Tikrit, but grew up there. Saddam Hussein was born right near Tikrit and raised in the same town. And he manages to not only unite the Sunni Arab world at this time, but to conquer Fatimid Egypt, the Shia Egypt, and to unite the wealth of Syria and Egypt and surround the Crusader states. I think it's also important and interesting to note that he had many enemies amongst the Shia, and in particular, the groups like the Assassins that I mentioned earlier, who threatened to assassinate Saladin as much as they assassinated or threatened Christian rulers. And Saladin realizes exactly what the strengths of the Crusaders' armies are and most brilliantly uses them against him, most famously in a decisive battle at a place called the Horns of Hattin, which is in northern Israel today, in the Galilee. He realizes the Crusaders' main army, the army of Jerusalem, is based, of course, in Jerusalem, a heavily fortified city, and he attacks the more remote Crusader outposts in the Galilee with the hope that the Crusader army will leave the city and join him in the north to do battle, which indeed they do. But he does this in the middle of summer, when these heavily armored knights in their metal armor, in their mail, in their heavy weaponry, are exposed to the full brunt of the Middle Eastern sun. And he positions his forces in the only water source in the area. And before the battle begins, orders that all of the grassland be lit on fire so that the heat becomes even greater, the smoke becomes unbearable, and the Crusader forces are defeated, again, by their own strengths in many, many ways. And this then allows Saladin to conquer the now far less heavily defended Jerusalem itself. The Crusades are by no means over. There are many subsequent Crusades. One of them is led by Richard Plantagenet, who was a very interesting fellow. For some reason, it's always seemed very, very odd to me. In England, they're quite fond of him. And they call him Richard the Lionheart of England, even though whilst he controlled England, he definitely, I don't think, really saw himself as the King of England. He saw himself as the King of Normandy, which he was, and England was very much the vassal of the Norman state. Spent very little time in England, which he didn't like particularly much. Probably didn't speak English, spoke Norman French. Yeah, didn't really like the place. Also bankrupted England by having to pay his ransom, fought a war against his own father, a rather unsavory figure, but for some reason they put a statue of him in front of the English Parliament, but it's not for me to say. My wife's family's from England initially. They can explain that, that's fine. But there were many, many subsequent Crusades. And one of them was also the Children's Crusade, where the idea when these Crusades are increasingly unsuccessful, that idea is raised that as perhaps the sins of the Crusaders themselves that are not allowing this to be successful, so send innocent children to go and God will open the gates of Jerusalem. This too is unsuccessful, and there is indeed a crusade where the Crusaders destroy Constantinople itself, the very city that the Crusades initially set out to defend. And in 1291, the last toehold of the Crusader states in the Holy Land is defeated in what is called Akko in Hebrew, or Acre in English, in what is today northern Israel. But that by no means ends the kind of crusading spirit. There are crusades in Egypt, and even the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish and Portuguese is perceived by them quite clearly in the historical record as a crusade. So again, if we see and we look back at this Europe, we see this is not a Europe that is on the ascendant. It is not a Europe that is dominant. This is a Europe on the retreat. And many, and I would say kind of accurately in some ways, say that it is this sense of retreat that spurs the Europeans on to ultimately conquer the Iberian, or reconquer the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and then conquer the Americas in an attempt to reach Asia, which they can now not access via the east. So they have to go kind of the other way around. That's why, right, that they do this. That leads to what happens in subsequent centuries and that Western expansion on such an enormous scale. But a big question and a legitimate question that one could raise is who conquers who? Because whilst for a period of time, the Latin Europe conquers much of the Arab world and the Middle East, it is when the Crusaders return to Europe that they bring so much of the knowledge of the ancient world that had been preserved in the East but lost in the West that transforms Western Europe. Words like alchemy and algebra and alcohol even all come from Arabic to enter Western languages. Mathematics, science, philosophy on so many different levels. And perhaps in some ways it seems so small, but most significantly, what we sometimes call Arabic numerals, although they're probably Indian numerals initially, literally, you know, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 27, 38, etc. Because of course, prior to this time in the West, they were limited to Roman numerals. And just imagine trying to build a cathedral with Roman numerals as the only that's difficult. That becomes really, really hard. And it's a small change, but it is huge. What is also interesting, I think, to notice and to take note of is how this term, a crusade, has changed in perception in both the West and the East. So as late as 2001, that's 20 years ago, what are we today? We're the 12th, 16th, 2001. George Bush used the term crusade when referring to this war on terrorism. Now, he was criticized for doing so quite significantly at that time, but it's important to note that in his mind, this term crusade was still a positive one, And indeed, the symbol of London in many ways during the Blitz was the defiance of this statue of this great Crusader king, Richard the Lionheart. Even if we look here at Australia in 1915, you see the digger shaking hands with the Crusader, right? Who is his role model and whose work he is continuing. And Ben Robert Smith, who's been in a bit of hot water recently over allegations of what he and other members of the Australian military have been involved with Afghanistan, was photographed, and his image, when he was still perceived very positively publicly, was plastered all over the newspapers. But the Crusader cross that he wears there in the center of his chest was actually digitally removed in the newspapers when it was presented. So, you know, there's a fascinating kind of point there, I think, to be made, both by him wearing it and the choice of the Australian media to remove it. And of course, Osama bin Laden himself, when he spoke about the war on terror from his perspective, also called the West Crusaders. Now, I think it's very interesting to note that the significance of the Crusades in the Arab and Islamic world was not great, it did not reign large until just over a century ago. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this. One of them is the Mongol conquest of the Arab and Muslim world that came after was significantly more destructive and significant for the Arab and Muslim world, so much so that the Crusades kind of paled in comparison, in contrast. And the Crusades really didn't have that great significance in the mindset and in the worldview of the Arab and Muslim world until much more recently. And the big change, and this goes to show how seemingly small things can have such an enormous impact on how history plays out, came in 1898 when Kaiser Wilhelm II, the emperor of the relatively new state of Germany, visited his ally, the Ottoman Caliph in Istanbul and then in Damascus. Now, for some reason, which is very interesting, Saladin had this very positive perception in the Western world throughout the centuries. He was viewed as the atypical Arab leader. He was viewed as this noble individual. And when Kaiser Wilhelm II visited the grave of Saladin in Damascus, outside the Umayyad Mosque, he thought it was incredible. And he was so overjoyed to visit the grave of this great hero that he renovated the tomb and built a second sarcophagus, which I don't really understand what the point of that is, a second sarcophagus for Saladin. And he laid a gold wreath. Now, as this was happening, there were many Arabs. Of course, the Ottoman Turks are not Arabs, they are Turks, who were subjects of the Ottoman Empire, who were just starting at this time to develop a sense of Arab national identity. And they stood there when they saw this Ottoman Caliph who increasingly they want to liberate themselves from. And they see this German emperor, one of the most significant, powerful figures on the world stage, coming and honoring this Arab, remember, he wasn't an Arab, he was a Kurd, but that kind of got lost along the way, figure of Saladin. They said to themselves, if they think this guy's a hero, he's probably a hero, right? He's probably somebody that we could rally around and see as very, very significant. Another funny little anecdote is that the Kaiser left a bronze wreath at the tomb to commemorate his visit. When T. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia, in 1917, the Arab revolt, with the Arab forces, conquered Damascus, Lawrence stole the wreath that the Kaiser left there, and it sits today on display in the Imperial War Museum in London. You go see it. So I love all these, bizarre little historical anecdotes, but I think that they do help tell the larger story. And indeed, today, many of the Arab states, the state seal, here you can see Iraq, the Palestinian Authority in Egypt, have the eagle of Saladin as their literally the emblem of their country. This is their emu and kangaroo. And there are statues of Saladin throughout the Arab world, in particular Damascus and Cairo. Now, let's go back to the Jews in medieval Europe for a second. I said that, after the Crusades, this is a Europe, again, increasingly on retreat. And again, I'm going to try to be offensive here. I hope, we're all, there's no vengeance like the vengeance of a sore loser, right? And it is as the Crusaders are unsuccessful in their desire to kind of change the world outside of their borders, that they have a increased zeal to define what the world inside their borders looks like. And it is an attempt to solidify Catholicism, to solidify what these increasingly, the term state can be a relevant term, look like, what they're unified by, and Jews are the most significant, the most obvious outsiders to this vision. And it's this time that a great wave of ghettoization occurs of Jews in Western Europe, the obligation to wear distinctive clothing, blood libels, so much of the most darkest experiences of Jews in Western Europe really come into place that didn't really exist prior to the Crusades, certainly not on this scale. And perhaps most significantly is the expulsions. All of the major expulsions of Jews from Western Europe post-date the early Crusades. Of course, there is the expulsion that most people are familiar with from the Alhambra Decree in 1492 from Spain and shortly afterwards Portugal. But it's not only there, Jews are expelled from England, from France, from much of Germany, the Papal States, etc., etc. And increasingly, there is nowhere for Jews to go. In the great centers of Jewish world in the East, such as Babylon, that we mentioned earlier, are at this stage on the decline. And especially when the Mongol invasions cause incredible destruction to, they said that Baghdad's population only returned to its pre-Mongol invasion numbers in the 20th century. This, of course, affects the Jews living there as well. And increasingly, there are few places for Jews to go. And we actually have quite a clear picture of what Jewish life at this time throughout much of the world looks like, because of the travels of a Spanish Jew named Benjamin of Tudela, who actually travels incredibly extensively throughout the Jewish world and leaves a fascinating record of what the Jewish world looks like. But there is one place, an emerging superpower, whereas I said earlier, not many Jews had been before, a new state in East, and this state is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is a new entity in Eastern Europe. It is a powerhouse there, controlling the majority of what is today Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic. And this is a state that has a problem. And the problem is that it has an aristocracy that is very small, that is Polish, linguistically, ethnically, and Catholic, religiously, controlling a far larger peasant population that is often not, that is also at times Polish and Catholic, but is often Ukrainian and Orthodox and otherwise. And there is not much in between them. There is no middle class, so to speak. There is not much of an urban population to kind of service this economy and society in between. And the Jews of Western Europe, who are at exactly this point being expelled, fit into this like a T. Fit into this like a T. And there is an entire body of art Polish art, this that I'm showing you painting now, is not a Jewish painting. This is a Polish painting demonstrating the kind of welcome of the Polish state of Jews into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at this time. And at least initially, the Polish authorities are quite proud and of the way that they welcome the Jews into Poland at this time. And indeed, I did a course at Yad Vashem, a Holocaust educators course in Jerusalem a couple of years ago, and they said something that's absolutely fascinating. And they said that in their research, there tends to be, and again, it's not absolute, but there tends to be a distinction in how Jews refer to Poland based on when they left Poland. That those that left Poland prior to World War II often refer to Poland as Polin, and those that left after often refer to Poland as Polania. And the suggestion was that Polania is a far more generic term that just refers to a country. But Polin obviously doesn't reflect either the English term for Poland, or the Polish term, Polska, but is a uniquely Jewish term to refer to the country, which could be translated loosely as Polin, here we lie, or here we rest. That finally, after these centuries of turmoil and persecution, we've found a place where we can be safe. Obviously, the tragedy of Jewish world history, and I'm sure we're all aware of what happens in the 20th century, makes that difficult to perceive now. But remember that if we're speaking about, from the 12th, 13th, 14th century onwards, there are many centuries in between. And so Poland, and again, I want to go into a whole depth of Polish history here, but this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is the dominant state in many ways in Eastern Europe for many centuries, but it is ultimately conquered by Tsarist Russia, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, spreading Jews throughout different states in Eastern Europe. But all, or almost 99% of all of Eastern European Jewry, whether that be in what is today Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Hungary, etc., has its origins in this moment, has its origins in this settling in this Polish state. And so in many ways, I mentioned Fiddler on the Roof, and I'll return to it, that this image of Jewry that kind of, I think at least in the West, is erased as the stereotype, the Eastern European Jew, which does become very significant in population. And again, an interesting side note here, and I don't want to get political, but a great element as to why Jewish population in Eastern Europe explodes relative to much of the rest of the world is that the Russian Empress Catherine the Great was the first to have a mass program of vaccines. And that actually increased life expectancy enormously in Eastern Europe amongst Jews and others, and led to a population explosion, including of Jews. Were it not for the Crusades, it's difficult to see how this plays out. And so, what might seem as, a very episodic period of history actually has enormous ramifications as to what the world looks like today, as to what the Jewish world looks like today. And if I think of my own family history, all of my grandparents, one of my grandmothers was born in Canada, but her parents were born in Poland, and my other three grandparents were all born in Poland, Polish Jews. It just seems difficult to perceive that it would have played out that same way had this seemingly disconnected event of the Crusades not occurred. So that is the bulk of what I wanted to share with you today. I hope I didn't offend anybody. And if I did, as I said, that was the opposite of my intention. But I hope you appreciated that. And I'm really happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
So thank you very much, Zach. Again, it's wonderful to have you especially present to a partly Christian audience, as you said, for the first time. So we're very, very pleased to be able to accommodate that. I'm actually going to hand it over to Mark, my colleague, the vice chair, to take the questions, but I want to ask the first question if I can. since I know you're into etymology, where does the actual word crusade come from? If you know.
I don't. I imagine it relates to the cross. Is my understanding, but that's probably the extent of my initial knowledge. Yeah, I think it was taking on the cross. The idea was literally that when people started on crusade, they would literally sew a cross onto their clothing, and it was you were literally bearing the cross on your body. It's my understanding.
Okay, so I'll hand it over now to Mark, who will lead the Q&A. If anyone has a question, you can either ask or put in the chat, and Mark will host that.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Zach. It's fascinating. History is such a fascinating thing, and I think sometimes we, when we refer to it in the singular, we miss a whole lot of the histories that are there. And you've added some layers to that story that I was unaware of until today, and invited me to have a look at that in a slightly different way. So thank you for that.
Can I just make one comment?
Yes.
Sorry, Chair. Again, we speak about you never know, cause and effect and how things play out. And I hope I don't embarrass him here, but just somebody that I haven't seen for quite some time, but I'm quite excited to see. I obviously wouldn't be able to present today if I didn't have the mouth and the teeth to do so. That my dentist, Philip Bliss, my childhood dentist, is here. So nice to see you, Philip, and the kudos is yours. Or the blame is yours, depending on how.
Yes, it's lovely to see you, and extraordinary, really, how time flies. But I used to, of course, see you without a beard. My question is, these Crusader castles are massive. I mean, they're really huge places that must have taken ages to have built and cost a fair penny. How was all that done before the Crusaders sort of arrived to defend it? I mean, I'm just looking at the logistics of this.
Yeah. So I think, from my understanding, firstly, it obviously wasn't instantaneous. It was a multi-generational project in many ways. Also, generations being a lot shorter than they were now, often for people. But something that I perhaps didn't mention, which I guess is also important to note, is that whilst when we look at these layers and these kind of waves, that pagan Rome becomes Christian Rome, and not all Romans become Christian instantaneously. And when Christian Middle East becomes Arab Muslim Middle East, not all people in the Middle East become Arab or Muslim simultaneously. And of course, when the Crusaders enter the Eastern Mediterranean, they're entering a diverse society that is also made up of significant numbers of Christians, in particular Orthodox Christians, many of whom are quite happy to see the Crusaders. Crusaders often didn't treat them particularly well, but perhaps better than some of the Muslim regimes, perhaps not. And so they had assistance. There were people both in terms of manpower, in terms of resources, in terms of access to trade that would facilitate doing things like this. They definitely had assistance in doing so. But one thing that plagued the Crusaders continuously, and is also perceived as part of the downfall of the Crusader states, is there was never a willingness of people from Latin Europe to move to the Crusader states en masse. People, more often than not, would come on crusade with the hope of going back. And so there was a constant plea for people to come and stay, because having those resources was very, very scarce. And that's actually one of the reasons why those orders, such as the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar, are formed, is just to have bodies on the ground to do things like build, defend, fight. But it is, I agree with you, it's incredible that they pulled off what they did with those limited resources that they had.
Thank you.
Hope
Sim,
that
I love
answers
your
your question.
opinion.
I will do so, absolutely.
It's a small world. I've got a question here from Jerry Winston. I've been told that by the end of the Crusades, there were only 10,000 or so Jews in Europe due to the behavior of Crusaders and their fellow travelers. Does your research suggest this is an appropriate number of Jews in Europe after the Crusades?
So first of all, I do apologize about my kids. I'm sorry if you can hear them. It's real. So when you speak about numbers in general, there, I've come to learn it's a minefield. It's an absolute minefield. And I gave a talk once similar to this and I spoke sometimes. If you want an audience that will put everything that you say to the test, speak to a synagogue audience, and you will. In a synagogue, and there was someone whose expertise and kind of had spent a lot of their academic career researching Western European Jewry, that I completely underemphasized how significant Jewry in Western Europe at this time was, and there was Jerusalem on the Rhine, and the numbers are far bigger than any historians and archaeologists say, and so it's really hard to say. It's fraught with difficulty. I think suffice to say, I think what's fair to say is that these weren't large numbers. I mean, the numbers just weren't large in general of entire populations. The great cities of medieval Western Europe were towns. These weren't large numbers. The Crusades certainly made the numbers lower, and certainly the bulk of Jewry were still in the Mediterranean and in the East.
What were the vaccines that Catherine Great introduced?
It was predominantly smallpox, at least initially smallpox vaccine, and that led to a population explosion in Eastern Europe. Yeah.
And also on YouTube, we have a recent conversation that we had on vaccines, giving Christian and Jewish respondents to questions around that that you can access. I noticed that Anna has unmuted. Anna, do you have a question?
I do. I remember reading some long time ago that prior to Christianity becoming the accepted religion of the Roman Empire, the predominant faith of that entire region was Jewish. But the percentage of Jews in that area was huge.
So it's a fascinating point that you raise, and I'm not sure that I would mind to say is that it was predominant. I think different pagan religions were the majority, but it's
percent they were talking about.
Yeah, it's estimated that in both Jewish and Roman sources that I've seen, that about 10% of the Roman population was Jewish, which is significant, especially if you consider that 10% was predominantly urban. So of the urban centers in Rome, a very significant percentage were Jewish. And there's a very logical explanation for that that's given. Pagan religions tended to be locality-based. So you lived in, give an example, you lived in Sparta. So you had your local Spartan deities. Of course, there was a larger Greek pantheon, but it was very much a localized religion. And that was true throughout much of the Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire urbanized and people left more rural areas for the centers, all of a sudden they were detached from those very localized religious practices and were left in somewhat of a void. And Judaism at that time was really the only religion, at least in the Mediterranean world, that had a kind of universal perspective. Of course, Judaism is in many ways a particularist religion, but had this idea of universal morality, of interconnectedness and the ability to practice across great breadths of land, much in the way that Christianity will come to be as well. And so in many ways, not dissimilar to today, in much of the world, as urbanization occurs, certain religious trends become dominant. The same was the case then. It's also important to note that in ancient Rome, there was a crime known as atheism. Atheism was a crime in ancient Rome, but atheism in Rome didn't mean what atheism means now. Atheism in ancient Rome meant not believing in the gods, right? Multiple deities, because that was the state religion of Rome, paganism. Believing in one God made you an atheist, okay? So now atheism was a crime that was punishable in ancient Rome for all but Jews. Jews had an exception from atheism. Why did they have this exception? Because Jews all paid a temple tax to the temple in Jerusalem, where sacrifices were also made for Rome. So Jews were doing their bit, right? The idea was, if you're not doing your bit in serving the gods, you put us all at risk. You are not doing the common good. Jews have an exception. And all adult Jewish men in the Roman Empire, free adult Jewish men, had to pay the temple tax to get their exemption from atheism. When the second temple, and that is why, for example, by the way, Christianity, when there's such a question of is Christianity Jewish or not in the early stages, this plays out, because if it's not, well, then you're a criminal because of the temple tax, because of this issue of atheism, because you now believe in a monotheism, but you're not Judaism, you don't have this exemption, which I think does actually play a significant role. And when the second temple is destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, the temple tax exemption is changed. And to punish Jews in the Roman Empire for the revolt, all Jews, not just adult free men, but free, slave, man, woman, child, need to continue to pay the temple tax, not to the temple in Jerusalem, which now doesn't exist, but to a new temple built for Jupiter in Rome. And this so frustrates and debilitates Jews in the Roman Empire that they actually undertake a revolt outside of the land of Israel, predominantly in Egypt and in Greece, which people do not remember, is completely forgotten in Jewish history, which is called Milchemet HaGaluyot, or the War of the Exiles, or Milchemet HaTfutzot, in which Jews rose up against Rome and killed a few 100,000 Roman civilians. No one remembers this. This is like the completely forgotten bit of Jewish history, but look up the War of the Exiles and you'll see it's a fascinating episode as well. Sorry, I'm seeming to go on all these tangents. People are asking initial questions and I apologize.
Okay, I've got another question. Thank you, Zach, and thank you, Anna, for your question. I've got another one here from Martin.
Yeah, it's interesting you raised the issue of smallpox vaccine. It reminded me of the story of the Year of the Elephant in early Islamic literature, when the Ethiopians were attacking Mecca and they held off and they all got very ill. And it was said that was the first occasion when smallpox hit them and saved Mecca. And the year Muhammad was born, of course, the Year of the Elephant. So just a real tangent.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And of course, changed world history.
For sure. Undoubtedly.
Or ancient Jewish date palm behind me from Elijah. I'm not even Jewish.
Everybody enjoys a date.
That's right. Very sweet. Shout out over. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Martin. I think so. I'll hand over now to Faye.
Here I am.
I'll just one.
So Zachary or Rabbi Gomo, on behalf of Council of Christians and Jews, we'd really like to thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating, engaging, colourful, and your knowledge has been incredible. And I think all all the resources, the pictures and information you had to add to your talk was just really wonderful. So thank you very much. And I think it's been a privilege for us to have you. And I certainly understand why Alex asked you again. And I think there was so much information that we'll be looking it up on YouTube. So thank you. It was really terrific. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I feel very honored to have had the opportunity to be invited and to be a part of this in my own small little way. And it was a real pleasure, really was mine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just sharing the screen with you all now. You'll notice that the Council of Christians and Jews Victoria website, where you can access information that is coming up, events that are coming up and events that have already happened. You can, if you wish, make a donation directly online. You can also subscribe for our newsletters. We are revamping our newsletters at the moment, and there are some really exciting things in the pipeline that are going to be happening with that in this new year. So invite you to find our website, ccjvic.org.au. You can also access Gesher, which is our wonderful journal, which comes out every year, a number of resources, and look at other ways to get involved with the Council of Christians and Jews. So thank you very much, Zachary. Thank you, Faye. Alex has had to leave for another event. I wish you all blessings for the high holidays that are coming up, to our Jewish friends here who are part of this day today. And I wish all of you, wherever you are in Australia or around the world, peace and prosperity. And we'll see you all again another time.